have lots of notes because this is a story that has turned out to be a little more involved than some other stories. So I'm just going to settle myself with my notes here.
Good.
Okay. Your insert in the bulletin
is really weird.
Is really weird? Why do you think it's weird?
Well, it's just an old picture.
It's an... You've aged well.
Well, goodness.
I had to convince Gary to let me use that picture, so I also kind of had to convince Gary to do this at all. So I'm in your gratitude.
Yes, I was reluctant.
Yeah, you were. Which is part of who you are. You're kind of a backstage sort of guy. Yeah. So I have known for years that Gary's vocational life included working for the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I knew that was born not because Gary applied for a job posting somewhere, but because he was friends with Jesse Jackson. And I knew that also Gary has some really interesting photographs in his house of people that I've only seen in magazines and on the newspaper and on television, and that these photographs have Massoni written on them. So Gary was in really close proximity to people like Cesar Chavez and Jesse Jackson and Dr. King. And this is the first time that I've been sort of invited to hear the story. And it has inspired me and challenged me and really been with me over the past couple of months as we've been talking. So the timeline is given to you because we don't have enough time to go. We don't have enough time to tell all the stories. But you have a brief, vocational sketch there, so that when we do tell a story, you might be able to follow a little bit of where we are in history. I also have to say that talking to Gary, we haven't been having a conversation just between the two of us. We've been having a conversation with Betty and Gary. And she is as much a part of this work and this story as Gary is.
Absolutely.
And there's really no way to try to speak for some minutes under an hour. We won't be here that long, but we said maybe Betty's the teaser for the other side of the story is Betty coming soon. To start out, I wanted to read something that Gary wrote. This is the opening paragraph of your 1989 preface to the master's thesis you wrote originally in 1971 for Chicago Theological Seminary. Mm-hmm. But then you published it in 89 in this collection with a new preface. And I wanted to read the way this opens because I think it is so true for so many of us as we reflect on our past. Looking back at old love letters carries an odd blend of nostalgia and anxiety. You are reminded of the warmth of the relationship, but you also worry that you might have misread the situation, that there might have been more or perhaps less than you remember in the letters and in the relationship. There is the feeling that you are looking at what someone else has done, that you are not reading what was written by the person you are now. Your choices and experiences and thinking in the intervening years have made you different, and the reminder of who you were earlier can be a little discomforting. Do you remember that?
I do indeed.
I felt like from a little bit of our talking that that resonated in a way with being in this period of life and looking back.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, because all of those years from 64 on have been pretty intense, and life in Corvallis isn't nearly as intense. And so, things have changed in my life and my thinking and my hopes, and I'm not the same person anymore.
Are you having trouble hearing, Gary?
Okay.
I also wonder if
Boost it up there. Is that any better? Okay.
Is it better? You might need a person in the back who's willing to go to Jen or Mary when.
Yeah.
So, Gary, will you tell us a little bit about the spiritual or religious context of your early years, however you might define that?
Okay, my early years, I was born at an early age.
No Benjamin Button here.
And started life in a small town called Yountville in California. And my mother dropped me off at the local church, which was a community church, no designation. And I remember almost nothing of it except hearing Bible stories around a potbelly stove in the winter. And that was kind of my introduction to religious life. Then we moved, I was going into first grade, into Napa. And that was another transition in church life, because I didn't go to church much at all then, except once in a while. Well, you have to understand that my mother was an Episcopalian and my father was a Catholic. And that's why they couldn't go to the Catholic church and wouldn't go to the Episcopal church. So nothing much happened for a while, pretty much until junior high school, when I joined the Boy Scout troop, which was sponsored by the Methodist Church. So on Scout Sunday, one had to show up, and I went, and I was very impressed, actually, even at that age. And so I came every Scout Sunday for a couple of years. But then I did begin to come a little more often. I came to the youth group. They had a high school, junior high, and high school youth group, and I came to that a couple of times. But I found that I was much more interested in what was happening on Sunday morning with the minister who's in that picture with me, the Andrew Juvenal, who was a pacifist. He was a strong advocate of equal rights. Napa, if you know anything about that part of California, is a very white town, probably more white than Corvallis even. And a black choir came to town to sing, and they were not allowed to stay in town. And Andrew Juvenal really spoke up and strongly against that. So that had an impact and impressed me quite a bit. I guess the other thing was about the church was that it was a fairly open congregation, but there weren't any blacks or any people of color in the congregation that I can remember. Now, there might have been one or two, but I doubt it. And yet Andrew Juvenal was very open and welcoming to anyone, and his preaching made that pretty clear. His preaching also made it clear a whole different set of values than I had heard before. One of those items was he did not think that it was appropriate to wear a lot of jewelry. So all he had was a very plain wedding ring and a very plain watch, and that was the only adornment he would allow for himself. He also was well-traveled, and he had a lot of good stories to tell about his travels. When he graduated from seminary, he and a friend decided they were going to go around the world on motorcycles. So they went out and bought motorcycles when they graduated and did exactly that. And he had stories about his visit to a Gandhi ashram in India, to visit Schweitzer and Lamborghini in Africa, just literally all around the world. And it was just amazing stories. So that really kind of brought me into the religious circuit, and I stayed close to Reverend Juvenile as much as I could, and he helped me quite a bit later on as I did some other things and made some other choices in life.
He really ignited something in you.
He did.
He lit a flame or helped to stoke a fire that was maybe ready to be burning. And then you have an interesting experience with the
side trip.
Military.
We're talking about the period of the Vietnam War, and a lot of us us meaning people at my age at that time, were trying to figure out what we're going to do about that. Some people, took off and went to Canada. Some people enlisted, and I had this wrestling with this thing that Andy Juvenile was a pacifist, and yet I felt like you had some duty to your country, something you need to do to give back, some kind of level of service. And I found in looking around at various programs, there was a thing called the platoon leader class within the Marine Corps. So at the end of high school, a friend of mine and I tried to enroll. He didn't make it. I don't know I think in the medical exam or something, he missed out. I did get accepted, so I was accepted into the platoon leader class, was supposed to report for duty in early 71, I guess it was. But in the intervening years, or waiting for that to take place, I had more contact with Andrew Juvenile and his pacifism, and I had some contact with the campus ministry, a minister by the name of Jim Corson out of the Methodist Church.
That's Stanford, yeah. So you're at Stanford.
At Stanford, yeah.
Thinking about this war and pacifism
right.
issue.
And at that point, I was wrestling with these various pieces of input about national service on the one hand. This was a program not like ROTC, but it's if you're accepted in the program, you spend your summers with the Marine Corps, but your academic year is totally academic year. It's not ROTC involved at all. And then you become, at the end of the period, and when you graduate, you get your degree, and you get a commission as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. So that sounded like a fairly reasonable way to start, to do this service to the country. But I was still wrestling with with Andy Juvenile and the pacifism, and I was also connected then through the campus minister Jim Corson at Stanford to the American Friends Service Committee and their draft counseling program. And after more and more struggle, I decided that I was not going to not go to the military, not go to the Marine Corps, and I was going to have to get out of the platoon leader class. Well, that wasn't as easy as it sounds.
But you did it. You got yourself out.
I did it, but it was not easy. And I had to show a couple of things. I had to show that I was seriously religiously inclined. I had to show that I was planning to do some career in that circuit, and a couple other things. So anyway, I did one of the things that they recommend, the draft counseling recommend. I pre-enrolled in seminary. So at that time you could pre-enroll, and that was an easy deal to go to Chicago, even though I was on the West Coast. And because I had searched around, and Pacific School of Religion was too close to home. Go to Chicago.
So you really throw yourself into this religious thing. You're like, okay,
yeah.
I'm going to pre-enlist, and then you do all of these. Juvenile also helps you find work at a Methodist summer camp, and you do supply minister work, and Tuolumne
and Soulsbyville.
Soulsbyville.
They're little towns, both of them in the Sierras of California, both of them pretty small. Soulsbyville was very small.
And in between those summer experiences, you go to France because you are a French major.
Right. Didn't get to go to France, but we worked out an assignment to be to work in a church in a suburb of Paris.
When you met Betty?
Oh, no.
Tell us about meeting Betty.
Well,
Because you meet in France. Yes.
we met in France, but that was a study program, overseas study program, in our sophomore year, and we were in the same program with 40 students, living in the town of Tours, France, in a building that had been designed to be a hotel, but the hotel didn't work out, so it got converted to a student center. And we both ended up in the same level of French study in that deal. And the requirements to get into this program, you had to have 2 years of high school French or 2 semesters or two terms of college French. Well, I had 2 years of high school French with a German professor, a German teacher. And when I got to Stanford, I took a year's worth of German, but it fulfilled the requirements. So I said, send me wherever. There were 3 campuses. There was a campus in France, there's a campus in Germany, and a campus in Italy. And I was hoping to get to be assigned to Italy, but it turned out I got assigned to France. And Betty got assigned to France, and we were both ended up in the lowest level of French knowledge, based on the entrance testing that they did. And in the first day of class, this is what Betty should be telling this story. It's so much funnier when she tells it. But we all come into the class, and the teacher starts reading the roll. And normally, Jen Butler here, just going down the list. And it gets to my name, and she starts laughing. So why would she be laughing at my name? Well, it turns out that I had so little grasp of the 2 years of high school French that I wrote my testing in German. Ich bin nicht dumm. So apparently that created quite a howl with the whole faculty, and this teacher really thought that was marvelous.
What's interesting about so many of your stories, Gary, is it's like, oh, and then this happened somehow, and then this other amazing thing happened, like this little blip happened, and then you meet Betty. And then at the end of these summers, I'm fast-forwarding us a little bit, you ask Betty to marry you.
Yeah, after a little longer, yeah.
Well, not the next day, obviously. And she says,
I had told her about my pre-enrolling in seminary and so forth, and she said, no, I don't know, I can't be a minister's wife, wearing the cute little hat and the feeling, and you have to be in the choir or play the organ, one or the other. You had to do these things. This is what she saw as a minister's wife had to do, and pretty much that was de rigueur, I guess. So, and when she told me that, I said, well, I'm not going to be that kind of minister.
which I think is so interesting that you knew that wasn't going to be the work you did, but you also didn't know.
I didn't know, but I didn't know. I did know that was not the best place for me. And so it didn't happen that way.
So she agrees to marry you, even though you're going to be some kind of something, and you're headed to seminary. And you pack up your car, and you drive to Chicago.
We drove our little Volkswagen Bug to Chicago.
In 1964.
Uh-huh.
And in the parking lot at Chicago Theological Seminary.
After we unload our stuff, getting the last load ready, a little red Corvair pulls in, pulling a trailer, and it turns out to be Jesse Jackson. And here we are standing in the parking lot, nothing to do because our stuff's already loaded, so we offered to help them unload. And so that was the beginning.
And Jackie, Jackie pregnant? Jackie's pregnant, and
They had one, Santita, their daughter, was with them, and she was pregnant with Jesse Jr.
Yeah.
And she was a little worried that, whispered to Jesse, don't let them move our stuff. They might take some of it. Keeping in mind that, Jackie grew up in the deep South, and so she had very bad image of whites. So anyway, that opened the door for a lot of relationship with the family, the whole family.
Yeah, your families really became friends and spent.
Betty was often over at the Jackson household tutoring Santita in reading, and Jesse and I would often be arguing theology in the halls of the dorm. And
I think Betty said she had to kick the two of you out sometimes. Go find another place to do that.
I couldn't imagine that.
A stairwell or something. Yeah.
Anyway, so we made our way through seminary, and Jesse and I did continue to take some classes together and argue together and so forth. But we, in this arguing was very friendly. We became good friends, and by 65. Yeah.
Why did she sit so far back there?
I don't know. I tried to get her to come up here, but she didn't.
So I want to know about how Selma evolves.
Yeah, so Selma...
and that is 1965.
That is 65, and we watched on the news the beatings at the bridge. So Jesse immediately feels like we need to go down to Selma because Dr. King had issued this call to any minister, seminarian, people of goodwill should come and join the march from Selma to Montgomery that they had tried to start with this beating that they received at the bridge. So Jesse starts to gather up a group of people, and one of my friends, Jim Burford, and we have another friend, Steve Davison. He'd go to Jim and say, "Well, Steve is going. Why don't you go?" And he'd go to Steve and he'd say, "Well, Gary's going. Why don't you go?" And come to Gary and say, "Well, Jim's going. Why don't you?" I mean, he was just convincing us through the back door that we should go.
I think that's organizing.
Oh yes, definitely organizing. So all of us did, in fact, go. Jim's had a Volkswagen van, so a big part of the group was in the van, and then Jesse had this little Corvair, and some of the rest of us went in the little Corvair. And we got down there, and just joined in with the crowd. The trip had one little kink in it, actually. We got in, I think it was in Tennessee, and we pulled into a gas station and filled up with gas. And this was like late at night, because we started Sunday afternoon, I think it was, and just drove as far along as fast as we could. And as we pulled out, we noticed that another car had pulled out behind us, a pickup truck, and we could see in the back window the rack with the guns in it. You know how you see those racks today? And this guy followed us no matter what speed we went, faster, slower, he stayed right with us. And we had not heard yet that Viola Liuzzo had been killed in this similar way, but we were still very nervous and anxious because we were in the South with an integrated group, male and female, and integrated black and white. And that was enough right there for some people to say, you don't get any further than this. So we stewed about this, kept going, and pretty soon this guy starts to pass us. And he passed us. And he went on faster ahead and went off on a side road. So nothing happened except that we got really nervous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was very scary.
Someone had been killed.
Yes, that same day actually, but we hadn't heard about it on the
Right.
radio. So we got into Selma, and it was altogether different. I mean, people were warm and friendly and welcoming, not at all like the white South. And so we went to the evening rally. Dr. King was speaking about starting the march again. And then the next day we had another rally and prepared for a march on Tuesday. Sunday we had the Monday travel, got there, and they were going to have this march on Tuesday. And so we got, I mean, that's what we were there for, to be part of the marching. So we got lined up with the crowd and walked through town. Part of the town, there were lots of sheriff's deputies leaning against their cars, you know, with their guns in hand. And then where there weren't police, there were other, I hate to use the word rednecks, but hostile whites along the roadway. And so we just kept walking on through as though nothing was going to happen. And got to the bridge, went up the bridge and over. And I was about maybe a quarter of the way back, so I got over the bridge and partway down to so I could see what was going on at the front of the line. The front of the line had met the same group of police, state troopers and sheriff's deputies that had been there for the Bloody Sunday. So that it looked like it was going to be the same thing, right? All of them lined up, the mounted police behind, And the front of the line, Abernathy and others, and Lewis, got down to there, and they kneeled to pray. And while they were kneeling and got up, they said, "No, you may not go any further than this." And so that's what they had said on Sunday as well. And the line just kind of froze while we thought about what that meant, because were we going to try to push our way through the phalanx of military people there, or were we just going to wait, or what? And they said, "You may turn around and return to the church." Whew. So we turned around and went back to the church, going past that same crowd of people that were hostile to our purposes. But that's why that day was called Turnaround Tuesday, because we were allowed to turn around and go back unharmed. Very different from the Sunday. So that was that little piece of episode that kind of made me feel like I was more deep into the movement than I thought I was.
Because you thought maybe you'd just take some pictures and...
Yes. And I did take some pictures.
Yeah, you had that camera with you at pretty much all of these stages in life, documenting.
Pretty much, yeah.
I remember when we were talking with Betty that, one thing that happened was Jesse was hiding, was needing to hide, to take cover.
Yeah, this was the James Reeb. I don't know if you remember all these pieces of the story, but he was the guy that was beaten on Monday, right, Betty?
Monday evening.
Monday evening, he was beaten to death. He'd been in a cafe, and he came out, and people came out behind him and beat him to death. Jesse and C.T. Vivian were kind of going through the neighborhood, and there was right across from the church is a large housing project. And they were kind of wandering through there and were getting the feeling that they ought to be getting protection somehow, because the police had totally cordoned off, barricaded all the streets around the church with their cars. You know, you can see they just park all their cars on every street, and any other kind of barrier they could put up, they did. And then they started looking for people who were involved in the march. Well, Jesse and CT were kind of wandering through this housing project, and suddenly realized they needed to get into hiding somehow, get out of sight. And so they were just kind of, moving around, running from place to place, and saw a door open. And so they went right to the door, and they said, "Can we come in?" And they went in anyway. And and it turned out that the person that lived in this house, which is like one of these totally incredible connections, the woman that lived in that house was a waitress in the cafe where James Reeb had been the day before. And she knew who it was that went out with the clubs and beat him. Now, how likely is that ever to have happened? But that's what happened. And they got on the phone then and called Dr. King. Dr. King called the Justice Department, and that began an investigation to bring some attention and some help to this whole process.
So from here, Jesse's really, now he's made some really intense connections with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and King and the connection with C.T. Vivian. Jesse had met Dr. King, passing through in the airport one time, but they didn't really know each other. But King had seen reports of the work that Jesse had done in his college days in North Carolina. And so, there were sit-ins and things like that. King was aware of that, and so he kind of had an interest in seeing more about him, and that then led to when King came to Chicago, including him in the plan. Can we do a quick breadbasket? So now we're at the point where 65, 66, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is signed, and King is the president of a Southern Christian Leadership Conference at this time, and he says, that's great, but we really are pushing for full equality, and we have to go north.
Right.
And so that begins this push into Chicago, and the Chicago Freedom Movement is born then in the summer of 66. And Breadbasket, which is sort of the next vocational piece of is part of Chicago Freedom Movement. SCLC had already been doing some breadbasket work in the South, but they bring that into part of the Chicago plan. Will you tell us what breadbasket was all about? Operation Breadbasket. Well, the Chicago Freedom Movement had three prongs: voter registration, jobs, and what was the other one? Housing, school.
Housing, yeah. And so the jobs part was Operation Breadbasket. And what that was a kind of consistent effort to go to various companies, large companies, and negotiate for job openings for blacks. And the pressure then was, if you don't do this, then we can exercise boycott activities. So that was the sort of the nature of the Chicago Freedom Movement, with efforts going on at voter registration as well, and this major effort to get jobs in various large corporations.
So in your thesis, you sort of, part of the definition of breadbasket was disciplined consumer power. And it was the first time maybe at least in Chicago, that what was being married was the church, the religious institution, and the power of the black church with disciplined consumer action.
Right. And the point was that we can, if you go to a supermarket, for example, which was one of our big targets, and negotiate for more job openings in the supermarket system, their system, if they don't cooperate and we threaten boycott, our message, well, you can't send the meat back to the cows, and you can't send the eggs back to the chickens. So you really need to think about how you're going to respond to this boycott if we launch this boycott. Well, we only had to do a couple of fairly short stints on the streets, but we were able to get several companies to open their doors to minority employees and change the nature of their work and the nature of their sales pitches.
And when you say we, you mean you and a couple of other people.
Yeah, 100 or so others, yeah.
So you and Jesse really worked, you created the beginning of this breadbasket.
Yeah, this was Operation Breadbasket was the name of the organization. It was a program under the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In Chicago, Jesse was the director. Dave Wallace was another person in the group, and myself and 4 other ministers. And then a steering committee. That was sort of the steering committee, but then there was another group of ministers that were very active and willing to do a lot of work on setting up and implementing boycotts if necessary.
I mean, the church was really being called into action in a very particular way. That I remember in some of our conversations, you and Betty would say, like, we could see that we were changing the world.
That is true. We could see it happening, which gave us, I guess, more courage than we needed. Those boycotts, and I mean, the negotiations were the key part. To go to the supermarket chains and talk about, needing to change their employment habits and patterns, and employ more minorities, et cetera, et cetera. And the threat then behind that was boycotts. And a couple of them cooperated pretty much best they could. We had some good victories there. We had a couple of places that did not want to see us come through the door and did not listen to what we were saying, and we did exercise boycotts against them, and they did change their policies, so it was success. I mean, you don't always get success.
Yeah. So we're now squashing this history of breadbasket and the work you did in organizing down into this itty-bitty couple of sentences. But I read that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference breadbasket staff in Chicago was sometimes called on by King to help organize in other cities where King was working. And when King was in Memphis to assist organizing black garbage workers, you and Jesse, and tell us how Jesse told you needed to get to Memphis.
How's that?
You were sitting in history class, right?
We were sitting in history class, and Jesse got the phone call that they wanted him to come to Memphis, and
And you needed to get out of class.
We just got out of class. I think it was the history class. I'm not sure. Anyway, the professor was relatively sympathetic, and
Yeah.
we'd already had some positive discussions in the seminary about all this work.
Although the faculty at CTS had also told you all that you needed to be students of the movement.
Students of the movement, not in the movement.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you and Jesse end up going to Memphis
So we're
in
on
1968.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't. This is the hardest part. In '68, Breadbasket had been fairly successful in opening a lot of jobs in several cities. Memphis was one of the target cities. And this is harder. Sorry.
No, you need to take your time.
We had a little gathering, staff gathering in the motel.
When you got so you're saying you were gone. You'd arrived at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, ready to do this work that you'd been called to do. There's a staff gathering.
Yeah, and we had there was a kind of a ballroom in this motel, and that's where we had our meetings. And when the meeting was over, King went down to I don't know where he was going back to Atlanta maybe, or I don't know. And then we heard a shot, and looked out, and it was very difficult to see anything, but we did see that there was something by the car where King was getting ready to go back to Atlanta, and then we found out that was King had been shot right there. And, well, that changed a lot of things.
I remember you told me that as you were sitting there, you looked out one window after hearing the shot. Can you bring me some Kleenex? You heard the shot. You looked out one window and you could see police coming down the hill.
Yeah.
And you looked out the other window and you could see the King was on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love for someone to find it. I think you have it. This morning you said there's a picture that was on the cover of Life, where it's King's. There's a group of people.
Oh, around the King and pointing.
Around King pointing.
Back
And
up
there's
there.
the hotel, the Lorraine Hotel, there's a window on the bottom floor with a figure, a dark figure standing in the window. And that's you.
It's on the second floor, but yeah.
Second floor.
Yeah, so we heard the shot, and I looked out the window, and then we could see the crowd around whatever was there. We couldn't really see Dr. King right there, but pretty soon it became clear that he was the victim, and ambulance came and took him to the hospital, and he didn't make it, of course. But
And the whole world changed.
that was a big change.
And Betty told me when you came home, so as I understand it, you and Jesse, you left, you knew what you had to do, you talked all the way home on the plane, and Betty said when you walked through the door, the two of you were just almost like catatonic to the world around you, but you were so focused on the work that there was to do.
That made it clear there was a lot more to do.
And so I'm going to have to fast forward a lot more than I wanted to at this
Sorry.
point to say. So after this happens, you do some different things. You work for churches in California. You come here to Corvallis.
As campus minister at West Ham.
You have a heart valve infection that also kind of changes everything.
It did make a difference, Not entirely sure. Haven't convinced me exactly how it happened, but there was something that got into my heart and created a problem on the heart valve. So I got heart surgery to replace the valve, and I survived.
You survived, but no one knew if that's the way the story was going to turn out, and it took you quite a while to recover from that. From that infection. I think Betty said, there was a lot of obviously stress and trauma, and at one point, Betty, I remember you said, like, his heart was broken. His heart was broken. That's what happened. And so you, eventually you do recover. You do some work in Salem. What was that?
Oregon Family Resource Coalition, trying to provide organizational support for families, with some legislative lobbying activities for supporting various projects and pieces of legislation, and then also working with groups that are working with families.
What I skipped was one of the Jesse phone calls. One of the other times Jesse would call you and say, do you call you Gary? He calls you Gary. He said, Gary, I need you. So in the 80s, in his second presidential campaign, right, second run, he calls and says, I need you to do this thing. So you took a leave of absence from Westham as the director of national scheduling for the Jesse Jackson presidential campaign. You have a great story that I really want you to tell about that rally in Texas.
Oh, yeah. A lot of time, doing the scheduling, you have to be in the office and, go through the mail that comes in, millions, not millions, but, hundreds of letters asking to have Jesse come and speak somewhere. But some of the time, you have to be out with him to kind of discuss what it is that is being offered, being asked for, and, sort of whittling it down so you have a reasonable schedule. So I went with him, caught up with him in Texas. Yeah, Texas. And where is this going to go again?
It's going to go to the man that you.
Yeah. So we were at a big arena, like a fairgrounds indoor arena, and Jesse was speaking in there, and I was sort of standing on the side, and this guy comes up to me, a white guy comes up to me, and I don't know how we started the conversation, but it was just a kind of a nice, friendly thing, and turns out that he had been a serious redneck, and what you want to know is the bottom line, right?
What's the bottom line?
Yes.
How bad was it?
Well, he had
he'd been in Selma too.
Yeah, he'd been in Selma on the other side and had his guns with him, and but then he heard some things and changed his mind, and he came, to this rally as a supporter rather than as a assassin.
He was a member of the Klan.
And was a member of the Klan. Yeah, it was really
and
striking.
That's part of what I read about Jackson's 2 runs for president. That both times, actually, he changed so much. So much changed because he was on the ticket, and voters, turned out, and things happened, and these relationships surfaced where people's minds were really being changed. And so you continued to work for Jesse. You've been, after that, you were working for Rainbow Coalition and then Rainbow Push, and your retirement wasn't all that long ago, really. It was in 2008.
Yeah.
I'm curious when you tell these stories, and when I listen, and I wish, obviously there's a lot more story here, right? When I hear this story, I think, wow, you lived one of those lives where, in a way, just because of the time of history you lived through, you really were in a place to see the world changing. And you were directly connected to the experience of how the church can change the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this is a totally different period of time for the world and for you. And so I'm curious about that active spirituality that I see so clearly in the thread of your story. What's it like now? What's spirituality like for you in this period?
Well, in some ways, it's nice that it's calmer. But the other thing is, it's not like I'm addicted to adrenaline, but it's when you're involved in some of these projects, it really keeps you going. You get fired up and you want to keep going. You don't want to stop for the day or stop for the weekend or whatever. You're just into it. And in some ways, it's hard to leave that behind. In other ways, it's not. And so it's just a mixed bag, I guess.
Is it a little bittersweet?
A little bittersweet, yeah. When there were times when we were on the road, going from place to place, doing something, going to rallies or whatever, and there was very little time to rest. At midnight you might get into a motel or something, but you were on call, on duty all the time, and at a pretty intense level, and it's hard to let that go sometimes. There's a kind of momentum that builds up, and you kind of say, well, why can't I stop? Why can't But there's too much to do.
I think part of your story that's so intriguing to me, and that I want to hold in front of myself as I move into, I hope I can hold in front of myself as I mature and grow older, is it's so hard for so many of us to move into the second or the third stage of life, where our active, working, vocational years are behind us. And now this whole new thing is on the table. And when we were talking, we said a little bit about there's a grief that comes with the person I used to be, or the thing I used to do. And how does your soul move into this new space and who am I now? And I think I hear for both of you, I think you both tell the truth about that stage of life, that it's actually not easy.
No, it's not easy. There's kind of, I don't want to use the word too loosely, but it's a little bit addictive. You get into a certain kind of momentum and rhythm, and it's very hard to change pace. And that was really true when I was really working, full time as a staff person. It's really hard to slow down and stop, even for a little bit. Just ask Betty.
Here's some good stories.
So, but now in terms of retirement, it's a little harder to think what the drag is. because I'm not recently actively doing the same things, but I still feel a little bit of the tug,
Yeah.
like a tide that comes rolling in every once in a while.
And I'm trying to convince you that part of the tug might be telling the story, which is so light-filled and so beautiful. And I think we've talked before in different groups I'm a part of in Corvallis about, well, we need to go find someone to teach us how to organize. And I'm like, oh, we have a teacher. I think part of telling the story is maybe where I hope the tide will bring you. It's stewardship season, Mr. Massoni. As you might know, this whole series of time has been about encouraging people in our community to tell their story of their light and how their light has been used. And I know that you and Betty and I have talked quite a bit about what the church has meant to you. And so why give?
Well, because any of this has to have a spiritual base. And you have to have a place to go for understanding and refreshment, to argue some of these things through. Most people don't remember that we did a lot of arguing about civil rights and this and that. And so I think the church has a particular role in opening our spirits to what needs to be done. And there's a role for everybody.
Yeah. You and Betty have talked also about how the church has just been there in so many different ways, in so many different manifestations throughout this whole story. Like, you'd like it to continue to be present as new generations of civil rights leaders are formed and shaped. And I think in many ways we're coming back to remembering the kind of potential nonviolent action faith and love have in the world.
And I think we're going to feel the need to do more of that, and not just think about it, because the times there are changing again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.